One. This paper was one I presented at Dr. Muda Abdi's conference a couple of years ago. It was called Anti-Racism in Practice, Working with a Love Ethic. It must have been early 2022, I believe. Might have been March that year. And I did it on my master's dissertation topic, which was called 1919, The Year History Forgot, Riot and Interraciality on a Decolonized School Curriculum, where I did one part historical study on the 1919 uprisings and this precursor of black soldiers during the First World War. And the other half of my thesis was about how I wasn't taught any of that in school. Um, so this session was based on my master's thesis, which I did with Leeds Beckett in the MA Race Education and Decolonial Thought. So here I looked at 1919, the year after the armistice signing, as an extension of the First World War, particularly embedded within the black-white binary. So I focus on black people and their relationship to white people in that time, although I'm well aware of the experiences of South Asian communities in that time as well, also Somalis and West Africans during the uprisings too, who were also victims. Um, so my dissertation was part autoethnography of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement. So autoethnography, so auto meaning first person, so auto like autobiography, and ethnography being a study of culture. So I use personal experiences to make sense of cultural experiences. And the other half was part historical study of black soldiers during the First World War and in 1919, the year afterwards, and sort of comparing those things to what I was taught at school and how Britain sees this conflict enmeshed within white supremacy or not. Popular media still represents World War One as a war for and about white men. As a black child, my memories of school sit juxtaposed to many of my black friends and colleagues. My earlier memories of education are in private schools in rural Northamptonshire, in the East Midlands slash the home counties. But born in Newham in the East End of London, I grew up in Northampton, which is mostly known for its shoe and boot industry. However, I spent many of my formative years in the Northamptonshire countryside and villages. Today, still, this is where I feel most at home, and I do like to go there and visit. I much prefer the rural and the countryside to the town and the city. Nonetheless, school was a time of quintessential Englishness and to some degree where I was indoctrinated into a Britain reminiscent of 20th century children's novels. So think about Narnia, think about the Secret Seven and the Famous Five, um, and stuff like the Secret Garden, the Railway Children, all of that kind of stuff. Um, with that with that in mind, as a child of the English private school system, it was challenging. It was challenging um, to see how many of the members of the white middle classes I went to school with viewed the First World War through the gaze of both whiteness and middle classness. I know that is not exclusive to white middle class people in this country, but it was interesting to me to look back on how many of my peers saw themselves in the generals and officers, whilst myself, a black child, did not see a picture of a black soldier until I was 10 years old. And that was because of my mother tasked me to do a project on Walter Tull. For those of you who don't know, he was one of the first black, well, mixed race officers of black heritage. Um, he was a footballer in Northampton, but he was also one of the first black army officers in the British Army, but he was not the first, contrary to popular opinion. Um, and one of the first black footballers in the English game at a professional level, playing for Northampton Cobblers and Tottenham Hotspur as well. Um, and this was a time when the British Army practiced a racist colour bar, preventing men like him from leading white men into battle. I wasn't educated with other black children, really, until I was 15 or 16 years old. at another private school in Northamptonshire, and black children may have only been 10% possibly of the school population, whilst in my year group it was just me and another black girl. However, with my formative years enveloped in that very white middle classness of English country greens and pastoral fields, I believe I do have some insider knowledge of how many white people of that class view the war embroidered in a nationalist fever of English England fit for heroes. At the start of the coronavirus lockdowns, it was also intriguing to see how the government used analogies to the Second World War to describe community responses to the pandemic. Yet I saw this was shrouded in whiteness too. Boris, at the time, so Boris Johnson, the ex-prime minister, and co were thinking about the war. In this history of white people, the history I learned at school, but no less a history in national memory that is incomplete in the national consciousness. Whilst we know black people fought in the war, what happened afterwards is not really discussed in popular media. So by the war, I mean, sorry, I'm referring to the First World War now. Uh, following heightened discussions about the anti-racism in the summer of 2020, I find it challenging how it stayed grounded in the Windrush generation as the starting point of anti-black racism in this country. Whilst we do know there was hostility to Caribbean arrival, this story is incomplete. Guardian journalist Amelia Gentleman, who broke the original story about the Home Office scandal, the Windrush scandal by the press, writes in her book Windrush Betrayal. On the day the Empire Windrush reached England, 11 Labour MPs had sent a letter to Clement Attlee, who was Prime Minister at the time, in 1948, proposing controls on black immigration. The British people were, they wrote, blessed by the absence of a colour racial problem. An influx of coloured people domiciled is likely to impair the harmony, strength, and cohesion of our people and social life and cause discord and unhappiness among all those concerned. The government should introduce legislation to control immigration to the political, social, economic, and fiscal interests of our people. Effectively, institutionalized racism in a late 1940s context. So, yes, there was hostility to their arrival, and I'm not disputing that. Simply, the story of anti-black racism did not start with my grandparents' generation in the 1950s and 60s. This is my grandparents' generation, and we would not have some of the luxuries we have today if they were not breaking down the doors, so to speak. But they arrived into Britain that was already hostile. This is something I have barely saw discussed at the time in 2020, though the Black Victorians and the Georgians before them, before the Windrush, all experienced racism. Representations of black people between the wars from 1919 to 1938 are also manifestly absent of the many films and TV shows that get made as well. So if we looked at the 20th century before 1948, we might find that 1919 in particular as a site of domestic white terrorist violence. So basically white terrorism at home against Britain's black communities across the length and breadth of Britain, including London, Cardiff, and Glasgow. When we consider that black soldiers were subject to horrific racism at the front and also via racist policy making, race, so described rioting, does not come as a surprise. Pertinently, when black and brown people and people otherwise not racialized as white were scapegoated for the lack of jobs in a Britain that experienced economic hardship in the aftermath of what was done to the war to end all wars. So considering the role of racist colonial ideology, something that did not end with the abolition of the slave trade, we can see then how that was a material force. So how that was materialized in how black people were treated when they came back from fighting in the war, in France, in Belgium, etc., and in parts of Africa as well, and the Middle East. Um, so yes, enslavement seemingly ended in the 1830s, but the ideology that underpinned that system lives on to this day, and we can see it across society, education, to policing. So what happened in 1919 is not part of the official history of Britain, let alone the war. If it was, we might see a paradigm shift in public debate about the conflict, but also the war, but also how the war is thought about and taught through the education system, including schools and universities. One of the aftershocks of those 1919 so-called riots was a pre-Windrush example of rolling back black residency rights in the 20s, effectively in short in shorthand, deportations of black people. It's as interesting as it is depressing that current debates, or now actually now that's official, the official nationality and borders bill have precedent going back over a century. I said current debate because at the time I wrote this paper, nationality and borders bill was still being debated, but now, 2 years on, it's now law. Um, so the reality of today's hostile environment has a precedent from over 100 years ago because the state knew it had been tried and tested. While some would argue the Home Office scandal is 70 years in the making, I would say it is more like 100, which was then built off further racist colonial thinking from a time where Britain was in a flesh for cash business of slavery, colonialism, and the underpinning ideas. As a black child, I grew up thinking about the First World War as a conflict about white Europeans fighting each other over land and politics. And it was only at 10 years old that I saw pictures of black soldiers and then later seeing images of Sikh soldiers and other racialized, racially minoritized people from the time. But what I will say is that I'm not sure the role of black people and brown people, etc., should be celebrated during the First World War or any of the world wars because these are wars over imperialism and colonialism as well. Our entry into those wars was not as equal participants because we were colonized. So that's one thing I'd get people to think about in our celebration of the war period. Black and white peoples and black peoples and brown peoples' entry into those wars is not the same, and those questions need to be asked and we need to interrogate that a bit more when we do things like Armistice Day and Remembrance and so on. Anyway, the role of British, French, and German colonies was conveniently withheld from my school experience. Later, I began to join the dots between the world wars and empire and colonialism. I didn't learn about colonialism in school either, so I did not think about these things back then. So there, I couldn't really understand the gravity of that conflict without a basic context around Britain and other Europeans' um, practices of colonizing. Nonetheless, we were told it was a conflict that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914, but it lasted 4 years. Following the conflict, however, there were as many as 9 seaport so-called riots. Um, in January 1919 in Glasgow Harbour and starting to simmer down in the late summer with violence in Stepney and Poplar in East London. But we know these so-called riots did spill into 1920 as well. As many of you might agree, Britain is obsessed with the war, particularly the second, when it comes to representation in film. It is a war for white men with other white men, and black people, brown people, and others not racialized as white appear beyond the interest of popular media narratives, contributing to the obscuring of history in the national memory, which ultimately backs the whitewashing of school curriculums as well. Because if we were to start to pick at this further, we would start asking too many uncomfortable questions. The powerful truth of history and how in some cases we have been sold lies and deceits as historical memory. In a short for the BBC, Geiger tells us when millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen returned from the front lines expecting a hero's welcome to settle into their old lives. Um, they were met with mass unemployment. Uh, a previous 1974 journal article by Roy May and Robin Cohen say how the events in Liverpool in 1919 showed the inextricable link between the origins of racism in Britain and its involvement in the colonial empire. The fact you can watch documentaries about World War One and not hear colonialism or empire mentioned once is part of the issue, really reinforcing how whiteness can be described in some aspects as the absence of race. It's whiteness as sameness, as Bell Hooks also talks about in her book Black Looks, Race and Representation. Jeffrey Green's book Black Edwardians shows a picture of Britain as home to black people between 1901 and 1914. He writes Edwardian Britain's population of African birth or descent was resident at the centre of the world's largest empire. Some knew no other land, and others were self-motivated migrant. There were ambitious professionals, youths anxious for education, parents concerned about the future, adults seeking tranquility, and workers seeking more money, as well as the descendants of earlier generations, he says. At the point of 1914, Britain was still a dominant colonial power, and that wasn't that long ago, a time where many of its black residents would be subject to anti-blackness, both to everyday racism and that of institutions. Many of the black service people that fought for Britain and the British Empire came back to the so-called imperial centre that was in every meaning a hostile environment, a prologue to the events of 2014 with the Home Office scandal, and who could forget when former Prime Minister Theresa May sent out vans telling so-called immigrants to go home or face arrest, or saying we can deport first and hear appeals later. So what then happened more recently with the Nationality and Borders Bill and the hostile environment had white equivalents in the first half of the 20th century. In 1925, the British government put in strategies to deport 2,000 black residents to the Caribbean under the Coloured Alien Seamen's Order, infamous for being the first attempt by a British government to restrict the employment of black workers. However, reportedly, Arab seamen from the Yemen, rather than black seamen in general, were prime target for this piece of legislation. My introduction to the First World War was through white soldiers at the front, and then later in the story of Walter Tull. So I didn't learn any of this stuff in school. So we learned about the First World War and the Second World War, but not what happened between the wars. In recent times, the story of Walter Tull has become folklore, especially in my community in Northamptonshire, a token for white institutions to use when it comes to Black History Month campaigns. And I'm not exempt from this, having written a few of those articles myself. His story is easy to latch onto for schools and other public bodies, mixed race, working class, orphaned. I mean, he ticks many of the boxes these organisations want to tick. However, I find the lack of analysis of what institutions did to him concerning, where he is used as a symbol of so-called black excellence in how he overcame racist policies by a stroke of luck and talent. Liverpool-based historian Ray Costello writes about high-ranking army officers ignoring racist policies in order to promote Tull to officer. This flies in the face of policy at the time, where the 1914 Manual for Military Law states commissions in the special reserves of officers are given to qualified candidates who are natural born or of naturalized British subjects of pure European descent. So I wasn't taught any of this in school. Not only is this history, but also how institutions violently discriminate even historically. So the history we teach could have sociological dimensions to it. The fact that white supremacy pervaded through wartime policy whereas sociologist Emma Dabiri stated in a video for BBC Stories for black soldiers to kill white soldiers disrupted the racial hierarchies that were invested in white supremacy. Historian Oliver Accelli further says the government were worried about damaging decades of white racial prestige. So when I bring this sort of stuff into school now, for example, black children's faces simply white because they've not been told any of this, many of them. Um, and they're seeing history in an image about them, even if it is to varying degrees about racism and colonialism and trauma to some extent. A lot of them have not been told any of this. Um, a history that so frequently reflected white men in news stories. In news stories that get perpetuated, and then the films that get made about this period. David Bowles is an education academic, and this is the first tweet in a thread about the history of education. Do you want kids to learn? Here's something we've discovered. Kids learn things that matter to them, either because the knowledge are cool, or because they give the kids tools to liberate themselves and their communities. Maintaining the status quo, nope. So in terms of my own story, I didn't give a monkeys about World War One until I saw myself reflected in it. Walter Toll, racialized as black, but he also played for Northampton Town Football Club. He lived in Rushden, and I'm sure he played cricket locally as well. So there are things within his life story and places that he went to that were directly related to me, having grown up in Northampton, which also dissented the London or city-centric nature of Black history as well. Black British history is very city-centric in the mainstream. But the story of Walter Toll as well was very personal to me because it was also local geography too. In a video for Double Down News, author and journalist Gary Young says that riots are polarizing. They are often masculine. People aren't racist for fun. They aren't even racist because they don't like black people. He is talking generally here and is responding to the violence on the streets that occurred in America in the summer of 2020. However, it is applicable to what occurred in 1919 as well. Hyper masculine, but where they differ is that these riots did have racial undertones, because one of the reasons was that white men had a sexual jealousy. In fact, they did not like black men dating and marrying white women. There was mentality, especially in Liverpool and in Cardiff. Yet discussing the so-called riots in Wales, um, scholar activist Yasmin Begum states unemployment across all working class communities and a perception that men of colour were stealing their jobs meant that hostility ramped up, she says. And that was in her article for Gowden, who unfortunately followed last year, but her article was still in our archive. Jacqueline Jenkinson also iterates that during the events in Glasgow, black sailors were accosted by the seamen's unions, chased out of the merchant marine hiring yards by white sailors when they sought jobs, and they were beaten in the streets, attacked in their boarding houses, and then targeted for mass arrest by the police, called in to halt the so-called disorder. So far I've discussed economic tensions, so i.e. job competition, but there was further reasons for these so-called riots, as in 1914, black families that lived in the East End of London, where some black men chose to make new homes, while others, because of the downturn in world trade and the colour bar, found it difficult to obtain passage home. And that was Howard Block speaking in Stephen Bourne's book, Black Poppies. Concurrently, this is intertwined with the history of the trade unions. So if we think about the most recent UCU strikes, so the university strikes, and generally workers' strikes today, so think about the trains, for example, as well, railway strikes, many people are still having a hard time seeing that if there's no equality for black and brown workers, there is no equality for anyone. In a tweet, Dr. Ornette D. Cannon termed us as the canaries in the mine. He continued to write ignorance. Sorry, write. He continues to write, "Ignore us at your peril," because the noxious fumes will also overtake you in time. So if there's no rights for black people and brown people, there's no rights for white people, basically. In 1919, the trade unions gave preferential treatment to white men over black men, while white women chose black men as life partners, and white men then showed feelings of sexual jealousy, basically an inferiority complex. At school, my teachers would show us photographs of white European men, predominantly British, waxing lyrical about how Britain won the war, but not how black people were treated when they came back to this country. Whilst these sorts of stories are historical, I think the way we teach history can also be multidisciplined. My dissertation study was historical sociology, if that's a term, and started to analyse the role of racial mixing in that period as well, as sexual jealousy from white British men in regards to white women starting families with black men and also Chinese men. This played an important role as a catalyst to the violence of 1919. Within intimate and domestic relationships, some white women chose to have children with black men rather than white, and this upset the racial order. In 1919, the Times newspaper reported Mr. Percival Clark prosecuting said that in Limehouse, that's in East London, there was a lodging. There was a lodging house in which over 100 coloured men resided. They came over here having been demobilised from the ships in which they had done transport duty during the war and were waiting for a vessel to take them home. Whether they undersold the white sailors or not, he, the council, did not know. But whatever the cause, the ill feeling was very great. If there was one thing more than another that white seamen resented, it was black sailors associated with white women. And that was from the Times newspaper during the Limehouse riot trial of 1919. Um, the First World War, to me, is as historical as it is sociological, and it moves across many other disciplines as well: history, sociology, criminology, crime, policing, um, film, media, TV, and loads more. Um, and the things I have so far talked about seem beyond the interest of the mainstream discourse as it will upset status quo and popular memories of that conflict. Cameron Caballero and the late Peter Aspinall discuss how interracial families lived in areas like Liverpool, Cardiff, and London in the early 1900s, as the Cardiff so-called riots were triggered when a white crowd saw black men returning from an outing with their white partners, and in the 20s shaped the race discussion where the state's efforts to deport unemployed black men was what Jacqueline Dickinson called a numbers game. Whilst there was also biases in news and police reports. That Calabro and Aspinall um, so racial statistics of arrests partially embedded in acquittals in the court. Such biases were to plague British race relations in the interwar years, they write. And while racial mixing has often been remarked as a new thing by the British press, it really isn't in Britain, as it was also done before the 20th century with the Victorians, the Georgians, and the Tudors. Historians and scholars such as Habib Onyekanubia, Habib Onyekanubia, Miranda Kaufman, Emma Dabiri, Peter Fryer, Caroline Bressie here as well, Cameron Caballero, Jacqueline Jenkinson, and others have long remarked on the history of interracial mixing in Britain. And that history goes back to at least the 3rd century, Britain was home to Afro-Romans of mixed heritage, who more than likely mixed with the local population as well. Nonetheless, the fact of white English women choosing to start families with black men was a threat to the empire and a direct threat to the sexual hierarchies that existed, where to cross um, so-called established racial boundaries and thus create mixed-race children was seen as disrespectful to one's country. So you can see the effects there of policing of bodies and sexuality and so on, which is also gendered as well as race. So I urge you to imagine the possibilities of a racialized, multidisciplinary analysis of the First World War in schools, for example, and somewhat the things that happened afterwards, entangled with employment and sexual jealousy. 1919 is an early example of white terror on British soil, with lots of the violence conducted by white men. The white men then accosted black sailors trying to find jobs, the white men that harassed black men in their houses, and the white men in government pioneering policies to deport black people for the so-called riots. I think the race and race riots should be attributed to whiteness and the white masculine specifically. Historian James Walvin discusses how all neutral observers agreed that the black community was on the defensive and its members were arrested, prosecuted for their attempts at self-defense, while all but a handful of the white aggressors went unchallenged. Conversations we are having now about police conduct. Well, when I wrote this was a couple of years ago. So police conduct, race policing, bias, stop and search, etc., etc. Black men from 1919 and into the 20s experienced too. Racist policing did not start with the coming of the Windrush. So there is a historical and sociological precursor here that exists before the Windrush arrived. In terms of my own experiences, I'm one of the more fortunate cases where I've only ever been stopped and searched once by a police officer. But as a black person, you never forget. I was 14. The feelings of humiliation one feels to be stopped really because of the colour of your skin. 1919 also shows another history of the police, and that racist policing did not start from 1948 with Notting Hill uprisings, or from the 70s and 80s with Mangrove, Brixton, or even the ordeal around Stephen Lawrence and the police investigating the Lawrences as well, which is part of a much longer thread that goes prior to the Second World War. In closing, World War One was a global conflict where racism not only happened on the front lines, but was a central part of wartime policymaking. When black people came back to Britain in 1918 and 1919, but did not meet the colonial definitions of. Sorry, let me start again. When black people came back to Britain in 1918, they were excluded from the victory parades as well. Black people toiled in European theatres of war, but did not meet the colonial definitions of human being. So I'll just actually say, go and look at Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masters here, where he talks about the term human and who was allowed into that space of human, and things about, I think he talks about racial epidermal schema as well, and within that, David Lammy's documentary. And I quote David Lammy here, in hindsight, because when I wrote this paper, he hadn't done all the nonsense that he's done now. So yeah, Lammy's documentary, Unremembered, Britain's Forgotten War Heroes, explores this further, where many Kenyan and Tanzanian soldiers were buried in unmarked graves due to the policies of the colonial government. I did not see Africans as befitting the dignity of a proper burial. The colonial secretary at the time would go on to be prime minister and voted the Greatest Britain by the British public in 2002. His name, Winston Churchill. Major George Evans, who was in charge of the graves registration, suggests that the erection of individual graves for the estimated 54,000 East Africans would be a waste of public money, in his own words stating, and this is quoted from Michel Barrett, who says most of the natives who have died are of a semi-savage nature and do not attach any sentiment to marking the graves of their dead. So that his quote was quoted by Barrett in her chapter in Bodies in Conflict. So if you want to go and read that, the books there. So when black folks came back to Britain by decree and birth, they were met with a hostile environment by the many white men that did not want to work with black people. Racist policy making during the war took the forms of a colour bar that institutionally prevented black soldiers from leading white soldiers into battle. But we know some white officers ignored the rules to promote black men that they thought capable, as in the story of Walter Tull. And I think Ray Costello also talks about this in terms of the black soldiers that were allowed to be officers. Well, a lot of them were mixed race, and many of them had, for lack of a better term, less melanin in their skin. Their proximity to whiteness was greater, and some of them, for lack of a better term, may have passed for white as well. So those darker skinned officers who are capable would not have got a look in that same sense. Black people came back to a hostile environment, including the rolling back of black residency rights. But now, as we sit in the tiger's mouth of white supremacy, both oppressor and oppressed, we must understand how these varied histories of the early 20th century are imperative to our understanding of racist violence today, and also how we must teach that time period in schools and universities and to whoever wants to hear it, and even to those who don't as well. And also how we present that conflict in the public domain, including remembrance and armistice. In decolonizing history, we might want to consider that it's not always about bringing new topics, but filling in gaps of what is already taught. In not doing that, it recenters the privileges of knowing who you are and knowing your history. Not all of us are fortunate to be able to trace our family tree. Lastly, I want to end by saying that the late activist and Archbishop Desmond Tutu believed that in liberating oppressed people, this also comes in liberating the oppressor too. And in that sense, he was talking about apartheid South Africa and going to Israel, Palestine. So in our schools and universities, the senior leadership teams that block avenues to progress are part of the problem, but they can also be part of the solution. When you block students from their history through dehumanizing policies and white epistemologies, white-centered knowledge making, you want to consider how that dehumanization functions through knowledge production. By that act of dehumanizing, it thus dehumanizes you too. It's not what some educators and or some leaders are doing to the students under their care, but really what senior leadership teams are doing to themselves. If we consider this current state of education system as a symptom of a white supremacist ideology, we can see how dehumanizing the other also includes treating knowledge systems and really histories created or about people originating from the global south as beyond the interest of our institutions. Dehumanizing the other is central to any system of oppression, whether we are talking about the ongoing ethnic cleansing being done against Palestinians by the illegal state of Israel, or the British government saying we don't need to decolonize the curriculum. Nonetheless, I do not believe you can tell the history of British racism starting with the Windrush. The Black Edwardians and those that lived between the wars made the trail for the Windrush to follow, and that's vital to understanding contemporary racist violence of the past. And their experience of racism, were predated by the Victorians and the Georgians. So, as psychologist Ghislaine Kunani writes, From the treatment of our ancestors to enduring race inequalities and hostility, we are deeply affected and shaped by what happened in the past, and this includes the violence and shame our forebears experience. We are part of our ancestors' stories, and our stories are part of theirs. Thank you very much. And as usual, if you've got anything you want to say in your comments, just leave in the comments. Yeah, and all my social media information is here as well. But yeah, thanks very much for listening.